You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship with David C. Baker and Blair Enns.
David, today the topic is high-performance firms, and I know this is something you've given a lot of thought to. Let's just set some context here. How many firms have you worked with in a consulting capacity? Like, forget about the people who've been in seminars, et cetera,
Sure.
or the people who read your stuff. How many firms have you worked with kind of one-to-one?
Yeah, about 800 now over the last 21 years.
Wow.
Quite a few, yeah.
Okay, so in those 800 firms, at some point there's a threshold above which these firms you would consider to be high-performing firms. What are your characteristics? How would you describe a high-performing firm?
That's interesting. You know, as you were asking that question, the first thing that kind of flashed across my mind was this phrase that I'm sure you've heard as well that says, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. That's what I call, bumper sticker management consulting, where it's short and it can go on a bumper sticker, but the more you think about it, the more it's bullshit. That was flashing across my consciousness as you were asking that question, because I can answer the question around the areas that lend themselves to measurement. We can talk about fees per full-time equivalent employee, or what the principal should make from a compensation standpoint, or how effective their work is in the marketplace, and so on. But there are some other things that I think they, like the principals, might say are just as important to them, which don't lend themselves to measurement. Like, for instance, the culture of a place, or how do we quantify the value that a principal senses from being their own boss? Because in many cases, there's this unquantifiable part about it, because they're taking on more financial risk. They're not making as much money in some cases, but the other side of the ledger is that, okay, I'm not working for somebody else, and I really like that. I like the fact that I can pivot when I want to. I don't have to protect my people from other bad managers and so on. You asked the question, like, how do we determine a high-performance firm? Let me just talk about some of the things that really are easy to answer, and that would be what somebody is making. I can't conceive of somebody making less than, speaking in U.S. dollars terms, less than $170,000. And that seems like it's sort of the entry point. And then they need to be climbing up there so that on a fixed regular basis, they're making, say, $400,000. And then they should be getting half to 2/3 of a substantial net profit at some point. So that would be one way to measure it. Is that the kind of thing you were asking about?
Yeah, and I'll ask you more about other measurements and financial measurements, but you seem to start off by saying that a lot of it would be, if not subjective, then difficult to measure. I suppose the culture can be measured, but not easily.
Right.
I'm sure you can put your clients into, if we wanted to really generalize, one of two buckets, probably more buckets than that, but you just look at somebody and go, okay, that's a high-performing firm.
Right.
Financial almost certainly has to be part of it.
Yeah.
I think you and I encounter principals of firms who are kind of entombed in their firm, or trapped by it, or feel the weight of it.
It's like they started their firm motivated by more freedom, and they actually have very little freedom because now they have to come to work to feed the machine. Whereas just before they felt a little trapped, but they could just quit, right? And they weren't responsible for other people. So those buckets are interesting to think about without necessarily measuring the water level in the buckets. What are the buckets? One of them is financial. Another one, I ask myself this question with every engagement, and many times I'll actually talk about it with the client I happen to be working with. And it's this: would I want to work there? Thinking about the people, the culture, the processes, the opportunities, and so on. So that would be another one. Would I want to work there? And then, of course, you could turn that around and say, well, does the principal want to work there? So money, do I want to work there? The other is, are the relationship they have with their clients such that the clients are having aha moments frequently from insights that the firm is giving to them? That's an important bucket to me, because in many cases, firms have slid into this implementation side of things. And so they're really more of a service provider than they are an advisor or guide to their clients. Those are the three big buckets in my mind, but obviously one of them is much easier to measure than the other ones.
Yeah.
Do you ever ask yourself that question when you work with a client, whether it's on site or on the phone? I'm not looking for a job, but I'd love to work for them or with them, or I can't see myself working for them. Do you ever frame it that way?
Yeah, I have two questions I ask myself of every one of my clients' businesses. And the first one is, would I want to own this business?
Okay.
Do I think there's something kind of valuable here that you're taking to the marketplace and I can see it would be fun, it would be lucrative? And the second one is probably the most important one. And that is, would I want to sell this business?
Oh, yeah.
And what I mean by that is, I imagine being the salesperson,
Yeah.
picking up the phone, calling somebody you don't know, just imagining that conversation and saying, hey, I represent this firm. We do this. Do you have any interest in discussing how we might help you? When you're removed third party, you just try it on. Most of the firms, at least in the beginning, the answer is no, I wouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because the value propositions are so broad and sometimes meaningless that you just can't imagine smiling and dialing all day long.
Yeah, right. But then the gap you're trying to close is partly what the engagement or the training is.
Yeah.
Is getting it to a firm that you'd be interested in owning or selling. Something I've been working on in that regard is just how to measure it more. And I haven't landed on the exact answer, but here's my thinking about that. You answered that question because so much of your consulting is around that, the selling and what it is that they're selling and how they sell it and so on. So picture there's this agency out there and I'm at a party and I hear that a good friend of mine that I care about is thinking about working there. They have an offer. And that's out of the blue to me. I didn't know it was happening. What's my first reaction? Is it to encourage them to work for that firm or to insert some sort of soft warnings like, you probably want to think about that. Like you might want to ask a couple of these questions because once you get in there, I think you'd find it difficult to adapt to this particular part of their culture. So it's almost like the net promoter question that we've learned to, it's like that single question, would you recommend this to a friend?
Mm-hmm.
It's flipping that around and saying, would you recommend that a friend you care about take a job there? I started down that path. And at first it was like, would you recommend that a friend come work with you at a place? And it became a weird question because people were thinking in the category of, oh, I don't think friends should work together. So now it's about, if you don't work there. So anyway, that's an interesting way to measure. How do we measure success? Would we want to own it? Would we want to sell it? Would we want a good friend of ours to work there?
So one of your buckets is, would I want to work at this firm? And expressed differently, would I want a friend to work there? On what basis would you make that decision about whether or not you want to work for one of these firms?
One basis would be, are they good people? So do I trust them? Do they know how to fight fairly? I like that phrase. Can you fight? Like, can you fight fairly with your spouse? You know, do they know how to fight fairly? Do you trust what they'll say about you? Is there a sense of camaraderie or loyalty? Or the flip side of that would be they throw people under the bus, vendors or clients or employees. Do they throw people under the bus? So that would be one category for it. Another would be around, do I really feel like they have something that they're doing that's worth it? Or is it just marketing bullshit? Could I stand in front of a room of 6 people in a conference room and could I, with a straight face, talk about the value that we're bringing there? So that's another bucket. That's obviously hard to quantify.
How important is the work to you? Like when you look at what the firm does, you know, when you're talking about standing in front of a room, I'm thinking we all look for different levels of meaning in our work. And I sometimes make this kind of dismissive comment about some ad agencies where I say, on your tombstone, it's going to say, he increased share of the adult wet cat food segment by 2%.
Yeah.
But that's me imposing kind of my judgment on the fact that, you know, selling cat food or whatever it is, maybe we should be looking for deeper meaning than that. That's me imposing kind of my values on other people. Maybe we're getting a little bit off topic here, but when you're trying on the idea of working for a firm or having a friend go work for that firm, how important is like how meaningful the work is, not just they're a good marketing firm or they do great creative.
Right.
And you can stand up in front of an audience and kind of feel great about that. But how important is kind of the meaning of the nature of the work that's being done?
If we're talking about a product or a service that people genuinely need and it's a service or product of value, I could get behind it and get pretty excited about it. And I would say that most of the things that marketing firms, ad agencies, design firms are helping their clients sell are okay. Like I don't object to the products or services so much as I object to how they're sold. And that bothers me more than the actual product or service.
So tying this back to high-performing firms, when I say the term high-performing firms, you conjure up some specific firms in your mind. You probably have like 1 or 2 or 5 or maybe as many as a dozen different firms that start kind of popping into your head.
Yep.
When you think of the high-performing firms that you've worked with and you look at the work that they do you see that they're doing something that's kind of more meaningful than, say, a firm that's struggling?
By meaningful, do you mean meaningful for society, or do you mean more cutting-edge, effective marketing for them?
I mean meaningful for society. Trying on the idea of going to work for this firm or having a friend go work for the firm and think, wow, they're really making a difference, or they're doing something on social change, or just to pick one. I don't mean to skew it that way, but they're doing something that's really, really kind of beneficial to humankind or the planet or something.
Right. Yeah. That's interesting. They would probably answer that question differently than I would, but whether they're making a big difference for humanity wouldn't be at the top of my criteria list for successful firms. It would be more about helping their clients sell effectively without wrecking the brand and without wasting money and so on. When I think about the different options on the scale of meaningful for humanity, there are some categories that are very meaningful for humanity, and then there are some that are really devastating for humanity. But then most of them are right in the middle, and I'm fine working in the top and the middle. I just don't want to work in the bottom. And so in the big, vast middle and then the smaller top, as long as it's in one of those two, I don't care too much. But I do care deeply about whether they are really moving the needle on behalf of the client. I think maybe another way to phrase that is incompetence really pisses me off. As long as it's a product or service that isn't evil, then I'm drawn to this whole competence thing. Are they really doing something with their client's money?
Let's talk a little bit about the way the firm's structured. Do you see any patterns, in particular, starting with ownership structure? Are most of these high-performing firms, do they have one sole owner, or how frequently do you see kind of partnerships, and maybe even partnerships of more than two owners who are working in the business together as partners? How often do you see that?
I'm working on a research study right now to figure out how multiple partners changes the decision making. It's not good, obviously, but I'm wondering how bad it is. Like if you add a second partner, does it just double the time it takes to make a good decision? On the other hand, is maybe the decision a lot safer? I've seen many very successful firms with two and sometimes three. It's really hard to find a successful firm with more than three partners, honestly. In fact, my first thought when I see a firm like that is, okay, somebody's going to go, maybe not right now, but it's going to happen. And so that in terms of partnership, one thing that I've seen, this is a scary thought. So I did this study around personality profiles, and I'm using a slightly different tool than you are and looking for different things. And there were almost 14,000 people that participated within the marketing field. That was a sample size. But a small portion of that sample was just principals, successful principals. And I ran that through statistical software, SPSS, and I'll try not to bore anybody here. I ran it through there to see if there was a common characteristic in where people were from a personality standpoint. And without a single exception, and this was more than 1,300 successful principals, without a single exception, every one of them was control-oriented. They were risk takers. They had a killer instinct. That was the only pattern. So many successful principals were organized and many weren't. Many were process-driven, many weren't. This one's really interesting. Many were extroverts. That style lent itself to selling in an older, traditional way, more based on relationship. And many of them were not extroverts at all. They were introverts, or I would prefer to describe them as sort of matter-of-fact people. But that one pattern was, without a single exception, true of that group, is that they had a killer instinct. And I've been thinking about that killer instinct thing for quite a while. I don't know exactly how to define it because it's a newer thought to me. That would be one common characteristic of these kinds of firms. The other is confidence. We've talked about that, so I don't need to go into it. But confidence either comes from, in this case, it comes from their mommy, who told them they were great even when they weren't necessarily, and they grew into that over time, or confidence from marketplace acceptance. So they didn't start out that way, but clients started to believe the story, and then it filled itself.
You're listening to Two Bobs, conversations on the art of creative entrepreneurship. Your hosts are David C. Baker of Recourses, author, speaker, and advisor to owners of expert firms, and Blair Enns of Win Without Pitching, the sales training and coaching program for creative entrepreneurs. For more information, go to twobobs.com. If you find this podcast helpful, please help us by telling a friend and rating us on iTunes. Thank you. Now back to David and Blair.
That's really interesting, that question about the common characteristics and the structure and so on. Let me ask you a question about that because you have more experience in this side. Can you think of many successful firms where the principal most responsible for business development is also managing client relationships to some degree? Have you seen that work? Or do we need to separate those?
If I think of high-performing firms, it doesn't imply size so much.
Not necessarily, no.
Not necessarily, but there's a size threshold where at some point you just can't do it. It doesn't stop people from trying to do it. But I think you get to about that 12 people or so. The answer is I see it. I see people trying to do it often because they really like selling and they like serving, and maybe they have high affiliation needs, so they lean heavily on relationship and they connect with other people who have high affiliation needs, and therefore they're in a relationship and nobody wants to get out of that relationship. So that standard I killed it, you clean it role that your typical business development person would be in, some people's personality profiles or motivational makeups keeps them from being able to extricate themselves from relationships. But I would say I can't think of any of the firms that I would consider to be high-performing firms where that is the case. Like that is almost always a constraint or a limitation.
Yeah, because the client issue may not be more important in the bigger picture, but it's more urgent. And so you can put off whatever business development activity you would have been doing to either solve the client issue that you are managing or maybe stepping in because the head of account service asks for your help. And so it distracts you from the business development. Overlaying this on the question you asked earlier, this is an example where partnership is really good because you could have somebody whose primary responsibility is business development, and you can have another partner who can lend that partnership weight to other issues without distracting the first partner who's managing the business development process. In other words, the roles of the two or the three partners are such that they don't look like a stack of plates, all doing the same thing, running their own little companies under the corporate umbrella. They're doing different things, so it looks more like interlocking circles in the Olympic logo. That clearly is the most effective partnership. But that doesn't have to happen either. I mean, I know, and you know, many large firms with one principal that are very successful. It is a good example of how to use partnership in that sense.
And thinking of those large firms that are run by one owner, operator, principal,
right?
What are the characteristics of that individual's role? Are you seeing patterns in terms of, what they do and what they don't do from successful firm to successful firm?
Absolutely. Yeah. I think of three things that they do, and these would be non-negotiable in my mind, not in any particular order, but one of them is running the business. And most of them are comfortable doing that. Some don't like running the business. They're conflict averse. They don't like numbers. They don't like projections. They're not patient, particularly around the people side. So they try to bring somebody in between them and the people to manage the HR function, to manage the high-level people. And that always works at the beginning, and then it always fails. That's not an overstatement. It's always better, and then it's always devastating. So they have to run the business. If they don't want to run the business, then they shouldn't grow. It's just a very simple corollary there. You can't have one without the other. The second is positioning, making decisions about positioning the firm and the sort of lead generation plan, many of the things that you help many clients with. And then the third is just, and this is very minor, but it seems like prospects expect somebody important to drop in on the process at some point and just demonstrate by that activity that the agency views this as an important moment in their history. So that would be the third role for a partner. The things that they have to get out of are in order. There's really strong research to support this. The first is sort of being the control tower at the firm. And the way I help principals think through that is, okay, if you run into a client in a social setting and you're chatting and they say, oh, by the way, what's the status of such and such? you should never be able to answer that question, never, without asking somebody else first. So that's the first thing they have to get out of. If they don't, their involvement is very unsustainable. They start to lose it because all this detail in their head just bogs them down. The second would be managing client relationships. So you'd sit down with every client and say, hey, who's your primary day-to-day person? And none of them should give us the principal's name. But those transitions happen in order, but over time, and they're tied directly to how big the firm is, right? You would have somebody else as a control tower when you're above about 6 or 7 people. You wouldn't be managing any client relationships unless you have other partners. If it's just you as a partner, you wouldn't be managing any other client relationships at 12 or 13 people. And then you keep moving out of different roles as the firm gets bigger and bigger. Probably behind your question is this idea, how important is it for principals to understand their role if they're going to be a successful firm? And I think that is undeniably tied to success, is figuring out their own role.
Yeah, and in particular, you're talking about the things that, they need to get out of. And so they're left with 3 roles. First is running the business. You mentioned one of those 3 roles is dropping into the sale. Is that right?
Yeah, but not so much that the new possible client gets attached to them and wants to work with them, but more just like I envision it as just 20 minutes on a 2-hour phone call and saying, hey, folks, I'm so excited about our opportunity and you're in great hands. I want to talk to you about the history of our firm and what's so important about our culture and our standards for customer service and so on, and then just bop out. So it's just like an executive dropping in behind enemy lines and then leaving again and let other people be the occupying force.
Yeah.
So Blair, I'm curious about what you see, because we sometimes even work with the same clients, but we're looking through different eyes in many cases. When you look at what makes firms successful, because we've already talked about the definition of that, but what makes firms successful? Are some things that I've really missed that stand out in your mind based on your years of consulting experience?
Well, I think it almost always comes back to positioning, and I don't want to beat that dead horse. I feel like we're always talking about it, but you've got a firm that's got kind of a distinct value proposition, claim of expertise in the market. The one thing that I'm still getting my head around is culture, because I used to be so dismissive of the term culture, and I don't know if culture creates a high performance or if high performance drives culture. And maybe you could give us your thoughts on that. Most principals of creative firms and marketing firms talk about culture. For years, I've just been so dismissive. Coming from the sales side of things, I would think there are 2 cultures. There's a culture of winning, and there isn't.
Yeah.
And anytime I heard somebody talking about the importance of culture, I would think that's your rationale for not creating a culture of winning, of us all going for the brass ring to see how good we can be individually and how good we can be as a firm. And we're all going to hold each other accountable. And so whenever I hear somebody talking about culture, I'd think, okay, that's your excuse for not being able to build a winning firm.
Yeah.
And now I think that's just so short-sighted. As I'm adding employees in my business, I've just been struck by how important culture is. The most important thing I ever do might not be the work that I do for my clients. It might be the people I'm able to bring together in my business.
Well, yeah, 20 years from now, some firm that you advised or went through your training programs, they may remember your name. They may remember some principles, but by that time, they'll have thought that they thought them all up, right? You won't be getting credit for them at that point.
Yeah. It won't take 20 years.
But these people will remember almost everything about how their career developed under your watch and the culture and what they learned and the opportunities you gave them and how you corrected them at certain points 20 years from now. That will be so impactful to them. I do feel like once you do have employees, your purpose in life is quite different than before.
Yeah, I'm seeing that in my business, and I can see the patterns. Like there isn't a high-performing firm without a strong culture, and I'm curious, what comes first? High performance drives culture, or culture drives high performance?
I think culture drives high performance, but I hesitated because there are high-performing firms if we just measure that financially.
Financial, yeah.
There are high-performing firms with terrible cultures. I don't have any interest in working for those because I'm not generally very successful at helping people change culture. It is what it is. If they have a vision for it, I can help them reach that vision more easily, but I can't change their heart around culture. That's interesting.
All right.
Great question.
Great answer. Let's pick this up on a future episode where we go deeper into the topic of culture and I further reveal that I know nothing about it other than I'm being struck by how important it is.
So that's the name of our podcast series, is The Things We Know Nothing About.
Yeah. I mean, why else would we want to talk about them?
Great.
All right. Thanks, David. This has been great.
We'll talk soon.
Thank you for listening to Two Bobs with David C. Baker and Blair Enns. Subscribe and learn more at twobobs.com. That's the number 2, BOBS.com.